one of the things that, we did at Blueprint so well was we ended up recruiting this international statistician network where we had people from, I think, a dozen different countries, a network of like 500 people. So I remembered how well that model worked for us with digital work. I saw that there was a lot of digital work being done, and we just didn't have enough people in the engineering department, frankly, when I got there. And every morning I'd walk in and we would have these kind of morning stand-up meetings. And every morning it was the same stuff. Our engineering leader, he would come out and he would say, I know we're the bottleneck. I know that we're holding everybody up. And to me, I was just thinking, well, this is digital work, right? That can be done over the internet. So it's stuff that can be done from anywhere. And it just started to click for me, like, this is the statistician problem that I'm running into here.
Right.
You don't have to get everybody in the same room to take a bunch of basketball stats, and you don't have to get everybody in the same room to, do a lot of the drafting and engineering work.
Welcome to Verify Infield, the Millwork Podcast. Your host, Jacob Edmond, CEO of Ductworks, will be interviewing experts in the industry to bring you insights and knowledge about the latest trends, techniques, and challenges in millwork. Whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out, this podcast is for you. So sit back, relax, and join us as we explore the world of millwork. Here's Jacob.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Today we have a unique guest. Hunter Hawley has joined us today, and to talk a little bit about his unique background as a successfully exited startup founder. More, I guess you would say, in the tech industry, but we'll talk a little bit about specifics of what that was. And then you came into the millwork industry, did a stint consulting for a millwork shop. And so I wanted to talk and ask Hunter today a little bit about his unique background, how he leveraged that experience to help a millwork company, and what he's doing now. Good morning, Hunter.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So to get started, I think it would be awesome if you could share just your unique background, how you got started, found the company you founded, and then from there, how you transitioned into consulting with a millwork shop.
Yeah. So the genesis of the company I started kind of goes back all the way to growing up in my little town in Kentucky. So I grew up in a town of 1,000 people called Cloverport, Kentucky. For anybody familiar with that area, it's near Owensboro, kind of between Owensboro and Louisville, right on the Ohio. But yeah, I grew up in a super small town. Graduated high school actually with 25 kids in my class. It was a public school and everything. So I had a little bit of a unique upbringing in that way, just in the things that I was interested in and kind of the way that I viewed technology in particular, because growing up in Cloverport, there were really two things that I knew and loved. One was basketball, right? Because I grew up in Kentucky, eventually went to school in Indiana, and that's kind of the law of the land out there. And now I'm in Texas and everything's football and whatnot. But yeah, back where I'm from, it's all basketball. So I knew that, played basketball, loved the game. And then growing up in such a small town, I also really kind of developed a love for technology and the internet, primarily because that was, in a lot of ways, kind of my window out into what else was going on in the world, right? So in the early days of the internet, getting to kind of log on and see that there were all these people working on all these cool things, and I remember as a kid watching all of Steve Jobs' Apple announcements and thinking that stuff was just like the pinnacle of how cool it gets, and still to this day probably think that that's the pinnacle of how cool it gets. But yeah, that was kind of the two things that I knew. I loved tech, loved kind of playing around with, teaching myself how to write code a little bit and all that stuff. And so, yeah, when I got to college, unfortunately, you see behind me, I've got my University of Kentucky basketball up here. Coach Cal never called me to go play for the team, which was a real bummer. I think he missed out on an opportunity there, but he never called me. And at IU at Indiana, the coach up there at the time was, it ended up being Archie Miller my freshman year. He never called me either. So I didn't get the call to go play college basketball, but really wanted to stay involved with the game. I actually in high school wasn't sure I wanted to go to college. Decided, I actually had a conversation with my dad when I was in high school and told him that I wasn't sure if I was going to go. And he said, Hunter, that's fine. You just got to tell me what your plan is if if you're not going to. And that had me stumped at 17. So I decided I'd go to IU. And when I got there, I really wanted to stay connected with the game, really wanted to kind of take advantage of the interest I had in technology and let that kind of, explore that in this new place with all these new people. And so what I decided, I decided I wanted to start a little business. So I called my older brother up and I said, hey, in high school, we used to run this thing where dad would film all my basketball games. I'd burn a DVD of them. The internet was so slow where I grew up that I had to burn a DVD instead of uploading it. And then I'd snail mail it to him because he was in college at University of Alabama, Huntsville. And so he would watch those DVDs. He would, take all the stats off of them. He's a real numbers guy. He's now an engineer working on batteries and or battery technology and all of this cool stuff. So he just couldn't help himself. When he'd get those DVDs, he'd take all our stats, tell me how many assists I got, how many turnovers I had, all this really useful information. And so I called him my freshman year and I said, hey, that worked really well for my team in high school. Why don't we try bringing some advanced stats and analytics to other teams back in our home state of Kentucky, right? It was just supposed to be this small little, side business that we ran very seasonally, just, basically November to March for fun. And he agreed and we kind of got after it. I started selling into, all the different high schools that I could back home. And he was running most of the operations and taking a lot of the stats. And we had a couple friends working for us as well. It started off for the first couple of years, just really low scale. We were doing everything in Excel actually, or on paper. We would print out Excel spreadsheets and tally up assists and rebounds and everything else that way. And then upload it to Max Preps or some other similar site.
So sorry to interrupt, but
Go ahead.
and I am not a basketball stats guy. So, but before this, or in lieu of this, right? So it sounds like it started with he would do this for your basketball team. I assume because this was something that for you, there was motivation to track these stats and hopefully be able to say, hey, look, these are my stats if I want to go get recruited or something. But in lieu of this, your high school team just didn't have these stats. Is that what I'm understanding correct? Like, is it normal that there's like basic stats, but these advanced stats, nobody is collecting them, I assume?
Yeah, so there's a certain baseline of statistics across, and still to this day, it's somewhat like this, but it's gotten a lot better. But when I played, it was, you keep standard book stats. So how many points everybody scored, how many fouls everybody had, that stuff's like required.
Okay.
You have to know how many points people scored to know who won. You have to know how many fouls people got to know who's fouled out. And then teams oftentimes will have an assistant coach or somebody who's in charge of taking maybe a little bit more advanced stats. But what we like assists and rebounds, still pretty basic though. We were trying to do things that were quite a bit more advanced, like take plus minus, which is basically a stat that just says when Hunter's on the floor, maybe he didn't score 50 points, but the team was winning by 12 points while he was on the floor versus when he wasn't, we lost by 8 points or whatever. So we would do some cool kind of different statistics that are really, really hard to keep live on the bench.
So some of it is once you collect data, you can then analyze that to get other stats as well as just collecting more data.
Correct. Yeah, that was the whole point.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And so then you said, hey, this was really great for my team. At that point, you had left and gone to college, and I assume he wasn't doing this anymore because you weren't on the team, and you said, hey, I think there's value here. And probably to those teams, your pitch was, hey, look, maybe you're doing this, but you're probably not doing it as well as we are. And also we can do it more efficiently. And here's the price, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That was exactly it. And there were other companies that were doing it. And because we were, two college kids, we were very willing and eager to do it for a lot less, right. to put it mildly. Yeah. So that was kind of the pitch, was that we were going to be able to deliver. Our idea was we're going to take stats that are commonplace in college and the pros, and we're going to try and bring as many of those that are reasonable as we can down to the youth level.
Okay. And so then at this stage, it was you, your brother, and you say you start hiring some people, but it's basically people you know and you're paying to watch film and track these stats, right?
Yeah, we were paying people just by the game. So we would send them an Excel spreadsheet, a YouTube link, and we would say, try and get this back in the next 3 or 4 hours, right? And we would schedule. We know that the team you're going to be watching is playing at 7 o'clock tonight, so be ready around 10. That's probably when they'll upload, and then we would just have people doing it like that. It was just friends of ours.
Wow. Okay. And did you have to teach these people like, hey, this is how, like, did you have your own unique process, or it was kind of, they know basketball, you give them, hey, this is what you're looking for, and it's kind of straightforward?
Yeah, my brother and I had a lot of discussion around this, and did kind of set some standard operating procedures, if you will, that we passed down. A lot of it was taken care of because these were people we knew pretty well, people we grew up playing with. A lot of them were from our hometown, and so we knew them. But a lot of late night discussions between my brother and I over what is an assist actually,
Uh-huh.
and a lot of arguments over how liberal we should be handing assists out versus the opposite. So it was definitely a lot of kind of back and forth on getting that process right and making sure we took into account what coaches were expecting and things like that.
Okay. At what stage along the way, like from the start, was this always like, hey, this is a business I want to start and eventually sell? Or was there a point in time where it was like, hey, I might be onto something here, or like, this is something that I could sell? Like, was there a genesis of how you thought about the business as it developed?
Definitely, I think for the first couple of years, it was a total just thing I was doing on the side. I was a college student. This was fun. I probably spent more time doing this than I did actually working on class. So it was a lot of fun, but I never had it in my head that this was going to be like a big company or that I was going to sell it or anything like that. It wasn't until after the second year of doing it, my older brother, he, told me, look, I'm going to get my PhD. I think I'm going to get married here pretty soon. I think probably it's time for me to step out of this. And, he wanted to go do like actual adult things and quit, playing around in this little stats business that we had. And so, he made the decision to step out, and he had been running kind of the whole operations piece of it. Right. So I was in charge of selling and making sure that what little technology we were developing was working and was good and everything. And that was a lot of my job. Whereas, yeah, he was kind of making sure the stats were accurate and assigning games to people and things like that. And so I realized after he decided to step out, I kind of had this decision during that off season. I can either kind of close it up; it'll be no big deal. We've only got maybe a dozen customers or something, or I can try and figure out a way to automate around all the things he was doing. And so because I had been teaching myself how to program, and I had been interested in this stuff since middle school, I decided, let's give it a shot. Let's see what it looks like to try and build a web app that can kind of automate a lot of what he was doing with the assignment of games and even the stat taking stuff. He was managing all these Excel spreadsheets. I had no idea how he was keeping track of all of it. So I spent that entire summer in Bloomington, stayed in Bloomington that summer to work on, Blueprint. And yeah, in that summer, I basically just built this PHP Laravel app that not only could you see all your video and stats in, but our statisticians it's what we started calling them. They would get their assignments right in the web app and be able to take the stats right in a browser. So that was something that nobody else was really doing, but it allowed me to kind of automate my older brother out of the business in a way.
Okay. So that was really the business at that point that had value was, hey, we've built this web app and this system that centralizes everything. You can plug and play the statisticians or the clients or the games, but the system is there in that app.
Yeah, and it was, my kind of mentality when it comes to startups and things like that is you've got to do things that don't. I'm not the first to say this, but you've got to do things that don't scale before you can really take off. And so what my brother and I were able to do is find, hey, there's value in doing stats for high school teams at this price point with this kind of turnaround time, with this kind of data set. And we did it in a way that I don't think we could have handled a single additional team that second year, right? Like we were maxed out on scale, but then I was able to, because I kind of had to, I was able to say, now how can we automate some of this and really scale it?
Right. Awesome. Well, that's awesome. So, you finished school, and I assume, and then at some point interest came and you sold that business, to another company. And talk about then your transition to, last year you ended up, getting hooked up with, I assume, some of your network connections and coming and consulting with a millwork company. What was your role? How did that come about? And then what was kind of the scope of what your consulting was to be with this millwork shop?
Yeah, so I was living in Bloomington and then Indianapolis for about a year. I lived up in Indianapolis, and my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was starting grad school down at the University of Texas at Dallas. She got her degree in speech and hearing sciences, and so when she came down to Dallas, I was always kind of in the plan that I was going to finish up some things with the business in Indiana. And then when it got ready to, where I could sell it, I would come down. And so we went ahead with that plan. And I think I moved down here. I'm really bad with dates. I think in 2022 was when I moved down to, 2022 around the summer. The worst time to move to Dallas is when I got down here. And so I still had a few months of wrapping up the business after I got to Dallas. I still had, and I had a couple of consulting engagements that I was starting to spin up, kind of thinking about what life after this business was. And in some of those engagements, one of the first people I met down here in Dallas, kind of in a professional sense, was a guy named Brandon Cotter. And he was working on, several different projects and got me plugged in and involved in some of those. And also was great about making some introductions for me here in town and kind of helping me sort of get established as a new guy in such a big city, right? I grew up in this town of 1,000. I went to Bloomington, Indiana, which is like a town of 80,000, thought that was the biggest city I could imagine. Lived in Indianapolis for a little while. Like it just kept progressing. And so Dallas, over the course of, not very long span of time, 4 or 5 years, felt, like a whole different world. And so he was very good, very good to me, helped me kind of get established and everything. And shortly after I had sold the company, I was getting lunch with him, and he started to tell me about this new project he was working on. He was taking over this millwork company, 77-year-old millwork company in Fort Worth, Texas, called Robert Shaw. They, had people in the shop that had been working there for longer than I had been alive, right? And it was just, it seemed like something totally out of left field for me. And I thought he was just telling me about it because, he was interested, he was working on it and was just kind of updating me on his life and what was going on. And towards the end of the conversation, he told me kind of his vision for this company was to implement as much technology as possible, really kind of take a view of it, of what would millwork look like, what's millwork going to look like in a decade from now, and how can we just go ahead and accelerate this company toward that. And so with that, he wanted to bring in people who, had millwork backgrounds, but then people who had technology backgrounds and maybe didn't know anything about millwork. And it's funny, one of my first questions to him was, what exactly is millwork, right?
Yeah.
Like, it sounds like this has to do with wood, but, what are we talking about here? And so he explained it to me and kind of ran me through the product line, the business model and everything. And, at the end, he was just like, hey, so I don't exactly know what role you could play here, but would love to have you come by the shop and just start kind of spending some time if you're willing. And I'm very much the type that, extremely curious about things. I love I love the process of going from ignorant about a particular industry or, process or whatever, and getting up to speed on it and being able to kind of speak halfway intelligently on it. Although I don't know that I quite got there with millwork, but either way, I love that process. And so I just said, sure, this wasn't on my 2023 bingo card, but neither was selling a company.
Yeah.
So let's take a ride with it. And so I really kind of went all in on it, and put down a lot of the other consulting engagements to focus on this for about a 6-month span.
Awesome. So I think that, your perspective is really interesting, because we have a lot of listeners who are from the industry, right? A lot of people who have probably been in the industry most, if not all, of their career. And this industry is, a lot of what they know. And so I think hearing from an outsider, so to speak, coming in, to me is always really interesting, especially even when I was working in millwork companies. It was, as we would hire people, bringing somebody new into your company, a lot of times that is like some of the best feedback you can get, when somebody new shows up and is like, well, how do you guys do this? And how would I know that? Like, they ask questions that you don't realize. Oh, well, if somebody new in here comes in and they don't understand this process, or they say, why do you do things this way? That means something. Because it's normal to everybody that's been there that may not know any better. What were some of the things when you first got there and you first started diving in that, are there any things you remember that were either shocking or surprising, or that you were like, oh, we can fix that, we can improve that, or, that we're just surprised you about an industry that is, because for me, the millwork is so, like you said, it's a 70-some-year-old company. They've obviously been doing something successfully for a long time, but then you dive in and you're like, wait, but you're doing this way. How are you guys succeeding when this is how you're doing it? Do you recall any of those types of things?
Yeah. So before I even got to Robert Shaw, they were telling me about how it was in the works to bring on an ERP system and to start like actually documenting some of this stuff, some of the work that was getting done. Because before I got there, and the ERP system really hadn't launched yet by the time I got there. So when I arrived, a lot of work was getting done by people walking around the shop and verbally telling each other, oh, well, this thing actually changed. We need to, do X, Y, and Z, or, here's printing out the drawing. Here's the drawing. That's kind of our, I guess, primary record for what's getting done on this. Is like, we'll just look at this one printed drawing, and if anything changes, we'll have to rip that one up, shred it, make sure nobody sees that piece of paper again, or they might build it that way.
Yeah.
Because we got to go to this new one. And so that was somewhat jarring, because coming from where I was, it was a young company. We had to do everything as efficiently as we possibly could. We had to do everything with the newest technology, or there was no chance of competing, really. And all of our competitors were kind of digitally native as well. They were all internet companies. And so seeing it that way, and seeing that a company was able to survive 77 years and was operating this way, was super interesting, because, I didn't really look at it as like as much of an, oh gosh, this is such a big problem, as much as an opportunity, because something had to be extremely valuable about what was going on there for them to continue to compete and get jobs and operate this way for so long. And so I thought that was probably the most jarring thing, was like, okay, how does anyone know what's going on in here? And they're like, oh, well, we just talk about it. It's, everybody just knows.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, I think that a couple of things there, you talk about the drawings being so important, this is, and a lot of times it is literally that piece of paper, not even just the PDF, but like that piece of paper, because there might be handwritten changes. There might be field dimensions written on it. And so without that record, nobody knows what to do. And so as you mentioned that they started implementing an ERP, I believe it was Energy, right? That you guys implemented. Okay. And you guys also, I know that just to take a couple steps back, Hunter, you and I met when you guys reached out to us, Ductworks, to help you guys with some drafting resources, and that's how we got engaged. And I believe you guys use Slack, right?
We did,
for communication and chat, which I imagine that was something new you guys introduced that wasn't at Robert Shaw before you guys came on, right?
correct.
And I'm sure loads of other things, but so when you guys came in, obviously you started, bringing in some new leadership and some new processes and things, but at the same time, I think, it was probably very much consciously important to understand and try to understand what is the inherent value that has made this company successful for 70 some odd years, that we don't jeopardize that with these changes. Were there ever actual discussions or thoughts? Well, what was that thought process like? And do you feel like there were things that you discovered along the way that you felt like, oh, this is the value?
Yeah, I think for me in the tech space, in particular larger tech companies, I feel like, but really just all throughout the tech space, there's sort of an HR practice of, you know, once you get to a certain point with an employee or whatnot, you go look for kind of the younger, potentially cheaper person to kind of take over that job. And that's pretty rampant through tech.
Yeah.
And that's the background that I came from. And it's like, that's just, everybody accepts that's part of the job. And then once you get to a certain pay level or a certain age or a certain experience level, you kind of either need to start your own thing or, you need to kind of accept that there's a cap there. And so, one of the things that we recognized really early, though, was that that's not at all how it needs to go at a millwork company, particularly because of the demographics of just like how the industry is, right? Like they're not, in my opinion, and this is also probably not a well-read enough opinion, but maybe you'll have some comments on this too. We don't have enough young people getting involved in, this industry or the trades in general, really. I think that's kind of becoming a more well-documented thing. But, we had some people, like I mentioned earlier, that had been at this shop for longer than I had been alive. And they were like incredibly skilled craftspeople. And it became really obvious that the reason they were able to operate without really using any sort of new technology aside from a nice printer, I guess, that they had and PDFs and things, the reason they were able to get by was just based on that alone, the talent that was in that shop. And so that definitely was kind of one of the first things that we recognized as like, that's where this value is. That's what we've got to protect and then build better infrastructure around.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, definitely, I've had a ton of conversations on this podcast and outside about the problem our industry has with recruiting and young talent, and there just isn't a source for it, and people aren't creating it. And very much so, most companies here in the US at least are kind of just either living off of their aging personnel and talent, or stealing it from each other. It's kind of like, once you've worked at one shop, you've probably worked at a lot of them in the same area.
Mm-hmm.
But that only, can last for so long. Eventually people retire and move on. Right. But also, coming from like a startup or business standpoint, that's very difficult for business owners to scale that. That's why it's very difficult to scale a business. You're like, okay, well now we have twice as much work this year. You can't just go and hire that skill and that experience that's been in your company. And if you don't have processes and systems in place, and if it literally is just that tribal knowledge and that experience, there's no way to say, oh, well, this is what I have to do. I just need this person with this skill set and plug them into this process. Whereas like, if you think back to Blueprint Stats, you built that web app, and it's like, okay, if we want to scale this, or the people who acquired it, we have the system, we just need more statisticians and we need more clients with games. Right. Exactly. So that poses a very, unique challenge that our industry has, I think, into scaling. And, I was part of USA Millwork, and, we were one of the companies everybody was watching to see, and there's been many more in the past and that will come that everybody looks at as like, oh, well, they, come in as outsiders and they crash and fail because they don't understand millwork. But nobody in millwork that is kind of taking that view of like, is trying anything different. And so my concern is there's tons of these companies that are still founder owned and led, that there is no transition plan. There is no succession planning, and there's no way for that business to continue. And what I see a lot happening in those companies is you have an owner or kind of a leader, and there's usually only space for one or two kind of right-hand men at that leadership level with them. And so kind of, you alluded to this, but in tech, it's like, okay, you can move up and then you kind of move and start your own company or go to another startup or something like that. There's a path for you, and you kind of move up and out. Right.
Yeah.
And there isn't really that in millwork. And so a lot of people get stuck at that middle management level and there's no career path for them. And it's like, well, I can either wait here until the owner retires and dies, or his right hand man retires and dies, or I go somewhere else, start my own company or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think, thinking about that, and you're, obviously you had a very short stint there, but what were the things that you guys were, as you're consciously thinking about these things, was there anything that you guys were doing with respect to that to try to kind of plan for that? Was from a recruiting standpoint, from a like, how do we make sure that we retain this knowledge and these people? What was kind of the thought process around that?
Yeah, so I don't know that we, in my time there, that I got deep enough into, what that looked like for the shop floor. But where I did get I took a pretty big step in that within like my first couple of weeks was in the engineering department, right? And so that was a lot of the genesis of how you and I ended up getting connected as well.
Yep.
You alluded to it earlier, but one of the things that we did at Blueprint so well was after we scaled it past just a couple of my friends that were taking stats for us, and after my brother had moved on and I was kind of running the thing solo, we ended up recruiting this international statistician network, right? Where we had people from, I think, a dozen different countries, nearly, a network of like 500 people who were watching games, getting assignments, taking stats, not all 500 of them at once, but, we had recruited a giant base of people, and a lot of whom were international. In fact, very few were even from the U.S. anymore. We were having such an easier time finding people to reliably work overseas and whatnot. So I, remembered how well that model worked for us with digital work, right? Like it's kind of a sort of a niche thing where you can't obviously like use this internationalized internet connected network to physically build products in your shop.
Right.
But I saw that there was a lot of digital work being done, and a lot of our folks in the engineering department, we just didn't have enough people in the engineering department, frankly, when I got there. And everybody, every morning I'd walk in and we would have these kind of morning stand-up meetings in the front of the office, and every morning it was the same stuff. Our engineering leader, who was this really brilliant guy, he would come out and he would say, "I know we're the bottleneck. I know that we're holding everybody up. We're working as quickly as we can, working as fast as we can. All these changes are coming in all the time. Like we can't keep up with it." And to me, I was just thinking, well, this is digital work, right? That can be done over the internet. In fact, at that time, we had an engineer who would work some days from home, was mostly in the office, but was experimenting with work from home. So it's stuff that can be done from anywhere. And it just started to click for me, like, this is the statistician problem that I'm running into here.
Right.
You don't have to get everybody in the same room to take a bunch of basketball stats, and you don't have to get everybody in the same room to, do a lot of the drafting and engineering work. So that's when we started going on a pretty big hunt for solutions on that front. We kind of explored, like, what does it look like to recruit people internationally? That process is extremely difficult for this, a lot harder than for basketball. The ads were a little bit clickier when you run that like a YouTube ad that says "get paid to watch basketball."
Yeah.
So a little bit easier to get people to click on it. But so we started looking for solutions. Our engineering leader, he basically had gone to this conference in Vegas with Brandon, our CEO, and had asked around for, what are other people doing about this? And they had heard about Duckworks and they'd heard about a couple others. And so we made a few calls, or I kind of took that project over from our engineering leader because I said, "Hey, you're way too busy for this. Hand it over." And I kind of, was excited about it anyway from, Blueprint and seeing the similarities. And then when we, hopped on our first call, I just kind of looked at Brandon, and Brock was our engineering leader. And I said, "Look, guys, like, this is what we need to activate yesterday because we are so behind in the engineering department." So.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I remember that. And so ultimately, for our listeners, for context, what and I haven't really talked a lot about this on the podcast. Don't usually talk about Duckworks a ton. But this is a great example, I think, of a, this type of engagement we partnered in with you guys, where we installed 2 full-time drafters as a part of your team, as a part of Brock's team, helping with drafting and engineering. Is something that when we started Ductworks didn't exist, wasn't really on our radar as a service. We were just doing kind of what we call project right now. Hey, quote a job, we'll do the submittals and it's done. But over the last year, this has grown to be the majority of our business. And really because of exactly what you're saying, is that so many companies, and I talk to them almost every day now, are struggling with this very thing. And it's like, hey, engineering's our bottleneck. We can't find good engineers. And part of the problem is that, owners are like, I want this problem solved, right? You and Brandon in this situation, we're kind of like, hey, look, this seems to make sense. They don't need to be here. Obviously, your shop and a lot of your engineers a lot of times push back, like, oh no, we've never done it this way. This is, how can we do this? They don't know what they're doing. But what we were able to do is, and we might have even started with 1 and then graduated to 2, but ultimately we ended up having 2 people that worked hand in hand. And they're people that we've been training for a couple of years now with, and in this case, Microvoam. You guys were switching to Microvoam or already using Microvoam, drawing millwork, drawing casework, drawing the type of work. And you guys were doing monumental work. I think was the first job we started working on, actually, very high-end stuff. And it was ultimately just, hey, you guys need an extra set of hands that are intelligent, trained in millwork, but they're going to have to learn the Robert Shaw way in this case, to some extent as well. And so that's how it started, is, hey, they're full-time resources that you use just like as a part of your team. They're have access to, in this case, energy to get assigned work, and Slack to communicate directly with your team. They're jumping on video calls just the same as anybody else, attending kickoff meetings and completing work daily, right? And it seemed like very quickly they were, making an impact, which was, hey, we've got a huge backload of work. Engineering and drafting are the bottleneck. How do we add some resources, divvy up the work, and get to where that department is no longer the bottleneck? Does that sound right?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I'll add a layer to it also, in that you're spot on. We did have a little bit of, our team was pretty good about adopting this, but we did have some hesitancy, some question marks, right? Of like, how's this going to work on our team? And, I think one thing that nobody on our team was too overly worried about was, oh no, these guys are coming in and are taking our jobs. Like, they knew what the backlog looked like. They knew that that probably wasn't something they had to worry too much about. And they knew that it was an industry-wide problem and all that. But it kind of changed the nature of the way our staff engineers were working, of the people who were full-time on site. They were starting to, I kind of played a hybrid project manager role in a lot of, on a couple different projects. They were starting to kind of become almost technical project managers, starting to even play like an after the fact sales role a little bit. And, they would come up with ideas and say, hey, well, you've got this dead space in your garage in the cabinetry up here. There's 10 really cool things we could do with that, any of them sound interesting to you or the client. And so we were starting to get these kind of direct relationships, and our engineers were starting to sell on some stuff. And so it became a much, when they were able to focus on some of that, as opposed to just, man, we just got, 14 new change orders, all of this stuff is disorganized. We, are never going to get through it. When they were able to focus, on ideas and working with clients and thinking really critically about, like, not necessarily what is the measurement on this cabinet need to be, but like, how can we make this the coolest product possible for our client? It became a really, really, I don't know, it just added a dimension to their job.
Yeah. And I think that, what a lot of people lose context or kind of focus on with, especially with engineers, is in millwork, engineers a lot of times end up becoming, I feel like they're kind of like when you leave an apple in a drawer, they just absorb all the random, the stenches and stuff, and they absorb all these random tasks, right? And everybody thinks like, oh no, my engineers, I need them to only be doing this. But in practice, we dump so much on them, busy work and noise. And I think like what you're explaining is, okay, we were able to take a lot of that, the day-to-day drafting, a lot of stuff, and allow them to truly be subject matter experts and the technical experts and focus on what they're truly good at as engineers and leverage their knowledge rather than, well, I could be, working on this highly complex thing and problem solving with my project manager and talking with the client or whatever it is. But instead I'm doing these 12 elevations of casework for the next submittal that has to go out tomorrow. And so I think being able to come in and free those few resources that you have that are so valuable in your company, when a company has, a small team of engineers that are overburdened and they're the bottleneck, they don't have space to really shine, and be utilized what they're best at for an organization. And so for us to be able to come in and kind of take a lot of that weight off their shoulders and also really help them to be force multipliers, because they were able to still instruct and direct our drafters. Hey, here's what I want you to draw here. Okay. And I'll go do it and I'll review it once you have a detail done. And then in the meantime, I'm going to go talk with the project manager about this detail and I'm going to get this custom desk out to production. And they're way more productive as a result, it seems like.
Yeah, and so one of the interesting things about Robert Shaw was they didn't have a project manager, to my knowledge. They may have had one back, long ago, but immediately before I got there, they didn't really have a project manager. And so the engineers were absorbing a lot of those tasks, right? Like clients were directly on their cell phones calling our engineers and asking, "Where's this? What's the status of that? Hey, can you verbal asks? Can you change this?" And there was no real process in place for that. And at first I saw that as like, oh, this is a giant problem. Somebody's got to step in. Like I'll step in and take on some of those tasks. But then, because I was, kind of in a consultant role, we'll eventually hire somebody who has more millwork, knowledge. I would get on calls with clients and they'd start asking about, all these technical detailed aspects and I would just be like, hey, I need somebody to come, come bail me out here. I don't know what they're talking about. But that was always kind of the plan. And the way that we were able to set it up with, having Ductworks and the two engineers we had on board, they were able to kind of start to delegate a lot of those engineering tasks as we've talked about. And it actually started to kind of work where they were playing a little bit more of that project manager duty. They were able to go out on the shop floor and help guys get unstuck because they had the technical knowledge, but then they were also able to go talk to the client and get really in the weeds about some stuff for the same exact reason. And it freed them up to do that. And so my initial thought of, we've just got to hire a project manager full-time to be, maybe multiple, maybe a whole team of them we need. My perspective on that really started to shift into, if these engineers are freed up to do some of this stuff, and the fit is right, like that could work. So
it started to make an impact outside of engineering in the business and change how you were able to think about your resource planning and staffing and project management.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it started to, as I mentioned earlier, it started to impact sales. And, if you view change orders like I do as a part of sales, as a function of sales, like it started to impact that. It started to impact, all kinds of admin stuff. Absolutely.
Awesome. And so, you mentioned early on, there was some, kind of apprehension or resistance, internally, and once things started playing out and playing, did that shift internally?
Yeah, I think that there was a lot of doubt internally about are these guys going to be up to the task? Are they going to be turning in work that is worth anything? Are we going to spend more time correcting their work than they saved us by doing in the first place? And I went through the same thing and had the same questions and doubts in my business when we went from all U.S. based, and a lot of times they weren't full time. We never had like full time statistician work. But we had U.S. based people who we used to just assign a client team. We'd say, you're doing all of this team's games all year long. And that worked really well because they got used to the team. They understood one of the biggest problems was player identification. If the video wasn't good, that kind of alleviated that. And we had this big question mark around quality when we switched to this international kind of, network model, Uber, Lyft sort of model where people could just grab games whenever they want. And I saw how well it worked there. And of course, I was no subject matter expert in millwork, but I said, guys, look, let's just give it a try. Let's see what the first, let's see what the first thing they submit is, see how it goes and just give it a shot. And so when they first got it in, it was pretty clear that they still had good high value work to add, right? Like they still had direction to give to ductworks engineers, and they still had coaching to do and things, but that it was going to save them just this enormous amount of time. And I think that was the balance they were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they wanted to hear that, oh, these guys can do everything you can do perfectly immediately. They have all the context, we don't really need you anymore.
Yeah.
But they also didn't want to hear that they're going to turn in stuff that you're just going to have to completely redo.
Right.
And it hit that balance really, really well for them.
Yeah.
So,
because I think that is, because I've had, owners reach out and say, hey, can I just make you my entire engineering department? And that, that isn't our business model. And I think for, the partnership, like what we had to be successful, is you have to have that internal engineering team that really drives things and partners with it. And the whole way it works is that we, become extra sets of hands, extra resources for them, that they're able to leverage their knowledge and their skills and amplify it and really focus on that. Without that, it doesn't work. And,
right.
As you mentioned, like the majority of what we do in millwork can't be outsourced, can't be offshore, right? The whole goal, everything that we're doing, is to build something in a shop in Texas and in the Dallas area, right? That then goes to a building that goes to a client in Texas, right. Or somewhere in the US, right? And that's not changing anytime soon. And it's okay, what are those digital tasks, that digital work that, okay, if there is a finite amount of resources we can get into this building in Texas to do this work, any little bit that we can get help from externally that, makes that possible. Because without that, it might not be possible to continue manufacturing in Texas and the US, right? And so I think that's important to have that context as well.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing, your experience and the work we did together. I think I'm really interested. There's two questions I usually ask every guest. And I'm curious from your perspective, a little bit maybe unique perspective, but what do you see with the experience you've had in the millwork industry and kind of from Al with technology and everything? What do you see changing over the next 5 to 10 years in the architectural millwork industry?
Yeah, I think that, from the perspective that I've got, I think that this demographic model and required shift is probably one of the biggest threats to, the space, and but it also is one of the biggest opportunities. And I think it's going to be the biggest driver of change over the next 5 to 10 years, because at least in the shop that I was working in, and a lot of the shops, it's a very collaborative industry, which is super cool. And so, got to talk to a lot of other people in the space and found out that it was the same there. The demographics of who's in the shop, it skews quite a bit older, a lot of times, and there's not enough people producing talent to, fill in the gaps when these people eventually retire. And you mentioned it earlier. I think a lot of millwork companies are kind of, they're just kind of, there's not a whole lot of a plan there. Like, hey, that these guys that have been here for 40 years, they're coming in tomorrow, I heard. So that's good enough for me, right? Like, and it's because, I don't think that that's entirely something that you can lay at management's feet in a lot of these companies. There's not really a great answer to it right now. So it's kind of one of those things of, you only focus on things in your control, right? And so I do think, though, that this is going to create a huge opportunity for young people who want to get involved in the space, and particularly young people who are tech native, right? And so there's all kinds of great technology shifts happening in the industry. And I feel like, from what I've gathered and from the people I've talked to, it has accelerated quite a bit over the last, handful of years, 10 years, whatever it may be, to where a lot, energy is getting more and more adopted, and, 3D, starting with 3D, engineering, like we were doing at Shaw, that's starting to get, a little bit more adoption, or at least doing 3Ds at all,
right.
Is getting a lot more adoption. And so I think that this problem of, well, there's not enough young people getting produced, not enough young talent getting produced to come into the industry, is going to get, resolved kind of in a hybrid way of, eventually people will realize there's a big opportunity to go work in the millwork space. Young people who maybe didn't, see that as their path. Like I said, I didn't have it on my 2023 bingo card by any means. But, I think that it'll be that, but it'll also be the fact that these younger people are going to be more tech native, are going to, be a lot quicker to adopt some of this stuff. They're going to be able to kind of take advantage of some of those efficiencies. So I think, I don't know if that is the clearest explanation of like what I see changing in the next 5 to 10 years, but those are the factors I think that are going to be most at play. Things that, are what I'll be watching out for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. No, that makes a lot of sense. So on the flip side of that, what do you think will remain constant? What will stay the same over the next 5 to 10 years in the millwork industry?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I found super rewarding about millwork was kind of the storytelling around all of it. I think millwork very much is kind of an artistic craft. As much as we talk about, engineering and things kind of clinically and exactly what's the measurement of this, like it is equal parts science and art. And I don't think that's going anywhere, right? Because I think a lot of the value of the product, particularly I'd say on the high end, but even all throughout the industry, there's a lot of storytelling that goes behind it, right? The craftspeople who are building this stuff, there are incredible stories in just about, I would imagine, every millwork shop in the country that you could go into. And just, this kind of incredible pride people take in their work, and the fact that it's been done here for so many years. And typically these are family businesses that were started and maybe have been passed down generation to generation, or are looking for new leadership or whatever it may be. I do think that balance of kind of science and engineering with art and just the storytelling of all of it it's not going anywhere.
Awesome. No, I agree. I think that's awesome. Well, Hunter, I really appreciate you taking time out to talk with me today and share about your background, your experience in the millwork industry. If people are interested in reaching out and finding more about Hunter or what your next projects are, what's the best way that they could contact you?
Yeah, always happy to connect with folks on LinkedIn. Drop me a connection on there with a message, and would love to talk millwork with anybody. Love the space. I think that there's a lot of cool opportunity there. But yeah, as far as what's next for me, I'm still kind of on the consulting circuit at the moment until I get that itch to start the next company, I guess.
Awesome. Oh, I imagine, gearing up to watch some college basketball as well for the next season.
Yes. Yeah. March is coming soon. I'm going on my honeymoon in March, and it's going to be pretty difficult, but I do think that, we're going to Italy, and I think that they've got internet over there, and I can watch the games. So we'll be good.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the honeymoon and the marriage, and I look forward to staying in touch and talking again soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Hunter.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Do you want to stay up to date about industry insights, new content, and our community of millworkers? Go to ductworksmw.com to sign up for our newsletter. I'll see you in the next episode of Verify in Field.